Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good evening. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil anbiya wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Saudari pengisi majlis yang amat berbahagia, Tun Musa Hitam, former Deputy Prime Minister, yang berhormat Senator Tan Sri Datuk Sri Utama Dr. Rafizi Yatim, Presiden Dewan Negara, yang berhormat Datuk Johari Abdul, Yang di-Pertua Dewan Rakyat, Datuk Nur Hayati, Datuk Mentadbir, Members of Parliament from both houses, Excellencies, Ambassadors and members of the Diplomatic Corps, Tan Sri, Datuk, ladies and gentlemen. It's quite surreal to be in this august house because this was the house that I took my oath the first time around. Back then, the original day one was under renovation. So this is where I spent the most of the part of my first term as Member of Parliament. It is also daunting, and you have everyone looking at you. I don't know how you feel in your respective seats because it's really cold. And then we are wearing baju batik tonight. Yeah. I grew up even before in school, those was early 80s. I grew up in a kampung in Terengganu watching Tun Musa Hitam as Deputy Prime Minister all those years back. This is the first time I met Tun, and then we are on the same stage. I wonder if I had come across Tun Musa Hitam much earlier on when I was younger, most probably you would have advised me not to come near to politics because there's so much drama. I don't think I have a lot of time basically because we would like to hear from Tun as well, and then I think we will have some time for Q&A. So let's start with a very simple question. I am here to share with you my assessment, my diagnosis, a sharing about where the economy is, what are we going to do about it, and what to expect from this new government. This is the first few times in the last 70 years where an economic function is given a full portfolio. Usually the economic function is always with the Prime Minister, either with the Prime Minister himself or as a department under the Prime Minister. I think this is only the second time. Tan Sri Wahid is here, my predecessor, all those years back. This is only the second time that the economic planning is given a full portfolio. And Tan Sri Rais did allude just now about how this government has come together. And among the first controversies, supposedly, was the fact that the Prime Minister is also a finance minister. Part of the design is to try to bring it back in terms of governance and separate between the fiscal responsibility and the long-term and mid-term economic planning. So previously, the long-term and mid-term economic planning resides with the Prime Minister when the economic planning unit was with the Prime Minister's department. The Finance Minister has always been responsible for the fiscal responsibility, the spending. And by although it was unconventional, because we were used to a situation for the last 15 years, more than a decade, whereby everything basically is influenced by the finance minister. Now, hopefully, with the separation, we will be able to bring about some semblance of separation. Finance minister focus on day-to-day, the fiscal spending, the fiscal balancing, whereas the economic planning is done with more of the mid-term and long-term perspective by the economic ministry. It also serves us quite well now, because we have to go through a lot of tightening here and there, given the fiscal situation. It would have been a lot more difficult if you have someone else as a finance minister, because you would have to entertain politics here and there, budget allocation here. It's a lot easier nowadays, because every time a decision is made to cut spending or to reallocate resources, any appeal has to go through the Prime Minister, because he is also the finance minister. And so far, it seems to be working quite well, because every time there is an appeal, every time there's a special cases, is a lot more difficult to go through a Prime Minister than, for example, a finance minister. So coming back to the diagnosis, I have two parts of my work cut out. The easy part and the more difficult part. The easy part is the diagnosis, because I think mostly people can understand and can agree on the diagnosis. If you talk to the market, if you talk to people who have gone through the process, who were decision makers years and years before, more or less we know what are the diagnoses, what are the challenges, what are the risks, where it will go if certain reforms are not put in place. And I take a great comfort that after almost 2 months, all the feedback and all the consultations almost come on the dot when it comes to diagnosis, which I will come a bit later after this. The harder part of my job, and by extension this government's job, is now that you know the diagnosis and you also more or less know the prescriptions, to actually do it. And successively over the last 10, 15 years, we have known the diagnosis, we knew what prescriptions should be in place, but either we got distracted, or we lack the political will, or it seems so monstrous that we don't know where to begin. And, what started as a symptom eventually will, come to a stage where we are now in a situation where the fiscal space is very tight to continue with the practices and the policies of the past few years. To explain it in a much easier terms, especially to the younger ones or to those who perhaps do not spend as much looking at the charts and the economic numbers, I think it's a problem that is akin to what most of us go through in our daily lives every day. It's almost like an overweight problem. I struggle with overweight problem every day, every month, almost every year. You roughly know what your ideal weight should be. You measure your weight every now and then, and constantly you are reminded that you're getting worse because you're getting fatter. You have to change your wardrobe every now and then. You also know that if you don't get fit, if you don't get healthier, what started as a minor weight problem and then becomes obesity, eventually you will get stuck with a myriad of other problems, diabetes, cardio problem, and so on and so forth. The prescription is also quite simple. You know that it's a function of calorie balance. You have to eat less, or if you want to eat as much, you have to run more. You have to burn more calories every day. Simplest prescription. You go to any doctors, you go to any dietitian, you go to any gym, they will tell you exactly the same thing. Most of us, despite the very simple diagnosis and the very simple prescriptions, most of us struggle with it. People make billions trying to get people to keep fit. That's more or less, I think, where we are now as an economy, as a country. We know the symptoms, we know the diagnosis, we actually know with this kind of fiscal space and trajectory, and I will get that, after this, it will get worse and worse and worse. So it takes a lot of courage and political will and cohesion of every stakeholder in the ecosystem, and that includes all of you. It's not just the government, it's not just the public, it's not just current, present decision makers, but also past statesmen and decision makers, and definitely a lot of our partners within this global trade ecosystem that we operate in, our trading partners. And it takes a lot of coordination, and most importantly, it takes a lot of political and mindset shift so that we can move in cohesion. And once I think we pass the first few difficult steps, and then hopefully the momentum of it will become easier and easier. And I can relate to that because I used to be more overweight than this when I was in politics in my first term. I used to be very fat. So I tried everything after I quit politics after 2018 to basically keep fit, because by then I realized that if I don't do something, it's not going to be pleasant health-wise. You try dieting, you try medicine, so to speak, you try subscribing to so many things, but at the end of the day, it's just a simple routine of walking and running at certain speed and pace, of certain hours, of certain distance every day, of balancing and cutting simple but very harmful habits. For example, eating after 7. And true enough, after 6-7 months, you get lighter, you can run faster, and then all those things, when you look back, that you felt so difficult to do, actually came quite naturally after a while. Of course, now I'm back in politics. After about 8 months, I'm fat again. So I'm constantly reminded, trying to do what I'm trying to do now with my job, to understand that the first few steps are usually the hardest. And once we get everything, the cogs and wheels moving, and it gets lighter, and I think 2-3 years down the line, I think we will feel very differently about the direction of the economy. We will start seeing whatever structural reforms that we want to do trickling down. And I think Malaysia can once again take pride that where we are now, which is basically we are, in a classroom, we are more or less that smart guy who usually score quite well in exams, but don't often get noticed by the teachers or everyone else. Somehow there's something missing, because result-wise you are good, but people actually think that you are left behind. That's exactly where we are as a country. If you look at our economic growth, if you look at our potentials, if you look at how well diversified we are as an economy, we have a lot of potentials. From 2019, 2020, 21, and 22, despite going through more than 2 years of lockdown, on average, our economy grows about 3% plus. In fact, for 2022, Malaysia is expected to be the best performing economy in this region. So we roughly did really well. But if you go and talk to the international community, when you talk to investors, even if we look at our stock exchange performance, somehow people will always say that, Philippines are more sexy for the investors. People talk about Indonesia. People do not talk about Malaysia lately in the same breath of our peers, when our resilience is so much better than our peers in this country. So that's why, I take comfort that as an economy, as a society, we are very resilient. We have all the ingredients, all the strengths. We have all the lessons learned in the past that will be able to put us back as a top performer, as a top student, so to speak, in the classroom, where a teacher look in a class of pupils and say, that's my guy. And that's basically what we are trying to do. And we have to start with the diagnosis. And, I'm hoping that we communicate this well, not just with learned crowd like this, but also to the public generally, that we have three major challenges. The first one is we have to consolidate our fiscal position. As an economy, our growth is quite respectable. 2023 is expected to see a global recession, for example, but we are expected to grow at about 4%. We are expected to buck the trend. So as an economy, if you talk to economists generally, Malaysia is actually doing quite well. But you don't feel it. The government doesn't feel it. If you talk to consumers, people on the street, and this, I think, was the mistake of the previous few administrations. There is no correlation by now between economic headline figures and what people feel on the ground. You can hit good growth number, you can show good FDI, our stock exchange can be performing so well, but generally, since I began tracking economic sentiment since 2016, people actually feel worse and worse and worse on the ground. And that's why there is a disconnect between the government's and the economy's performance with what people feel how the government has been performing. And the reason for that is, it's not so much about the economy, it is about the fiscal position. We have been spending, and that spending has been growing by leaps and bounds on things like subsidies that started out with a good intention, but given everything that has been happening globally with crude oil prices shooting up, we have global supply chain disruptions, we have the war in Ukraine and Russia, and then we have COVID for 2 years. What started as a small subsidy is now, if you're not careful and if you don't do something about it, will easily take up between 30 to 40% of our operating budget every year. So if you think about it, right, out of 100 ringgit that we have to spend every year to manage this country, 30% say has to go to keeping prices as how people would like it to be. Another 20% plus to pay for interest, and the rest most probably is to pay for emoluments. And obviously emoluments will keep going up, and then at the rate we are going, subsidies will keep going up. So unless we do something about it, our fiscal position will become thinner and thinner, and that will take away the country's ability to allocate resources, especially on investments or capital or development expenditure that can redirect and refocus this economy towards those sectors that we have to be. So we all have been talking about it. We have to start rationalizing our subsidy bill. We have to move towards targeted subsidy. We have to make sure there are no leakages. We have to manage between the public expectation about prices as well as not getting addicted too much to keeping prices artificially low. So that's known. The second challenge is to broaden our revenue base. As a country in this region, Malaysia is in the bottom three, only above Laos actually, in terms of the percentage of tax revenue out of GDP. So out of the total economy every year, the amount that finally comes back to government as tax revenue, if you take that figure to assess our fiscal strength and resilience of the government's fiscal position year after year, we rank above Laos and more or less at Indonesia's level. Which means that despite respectable growth, if we don't fix this, it will not be able to resolve a lot of the problems because the government spending and fiscal position is very limited. The economy can grow, companies can make money, but we just don't have enough money to move to the next speed and pace, so to speak. So broadening the tax base is no longer an option. It's something that we have to put in place very quickly, especially if we expect the next 2-3 years to be very challenging globally. If there is a recession, the spillover will come to Malaysia, and obviously whatever we already have in terms of revenue, we might get less. And if we don't manage the subsidy and all the others, obviously our fiscal position gets worse and worse. And that brings us to the third challenge, which is to restructure the economy. And of course, everyone has been talking about it. Restructuring economy, restructuring economy, restructuring economy. If you talk to people from the men on the streets all the way to the CEOs, all the way to investors, venture capitalists, they would tell you the same thing. We must move up the value chain from one that is based on low-wage, manufacturing-driven economy to one where it's service-based, where there is a high tech and value content. But obviously, it's easier said than done because it requires so many things. We have to refocus and pivot our technical skill training. Nowadays, for example, when investors want to relocate to Malaysia or expand in Malaysia, it's no longer just about incentives or tax policies. It is more about our ability to provide the right skill workforce for them. Because we are no longer in that low value, low wage manufacturing base. We have to move 1-2 tiers much higher than our peers. And that proves to be quite difficult, at least for the last 1 or 2 decades, for example. We have to restructure the economy in terms of digitization. We can unlock 1 or 2% GDP growth if we close our digitization gap, not just in the economy, but especially in government services. Because the more you digitize, hopefully, the more efficient it is, the more saving, the faster and the more voluminous transactions will be. So all these challenges are known. The diagnosis basically is consistent no matter which parties you sit down with. The difficulties, which is the difficult part, is how exactly to get started. I hope with the current government, with a very strong majority, this is, I think, on record, the most stable majority government and administration that we have had since 2004. I hope that allows us the 5 years that is needed to bite all the bullets that we need to do. And whatever key decisions that we have to do when it comes to subsidy rationalization, broadening the tax base, pivoting our focus towards a more value-adding service economy, that has to happen sooner rather than later. And by that, I mean in this 1 or 2 years, in fact, in the next 9 months. Because it will take time, after a decision has been made, it will take time before the implementation kicks in, and the window before the political situation gets murkier, because for every 1 year you don't move, you move closer to the next general election. And politics in Malaysia is a lot less predictable than during the time of Tan Sri Rais and also Tun Musa Hitam. It's very difficult to tell how things will turn out to be. So I hope with the strong mandate in Parliament that we have, we will be able to make all the key decisions that have eluded previous administrations. We also have to see things and do things differently. Tan Sri Halim is here. I've spent the last 60 days sitting down with my ministry, and I inherit EPU for the planning. My KSU is here. Among the things that I realized is that in the past, policies are made, and there are ways that policies will just filter and get implemented. But back then, things did not move, and the economy was not as dynamic as it is now. So if in the past we can approach economic planning and economic management with much longer term perspective, is a lot more dynamic nowadays, that even the planning has to be a lot more agile than before. Previously, we can do a 5-year term planning, put it in place, and then allow it to be implemented and see how the economy reacts to it. Nowadays, the ability to review and then to take feedback and then to adjust very quickly to the changing environment, which we call the agility to it, it requires, for example, a mindset shift even among policymakers and civil service to understand that if we were to be that agile, we have to allow for mistakes to be made. There is no such thing that one plan and it will allow it to happen for 5 years, and therefore people spend so much time trying to get so-called the perfect plan. There's no such thing anymore. It's always learning, iterating, trying, getting the feedback. So that is actually quite alien even in our delivery service. So there is a need to really shift from all the practices, all the processes that we have had in government, and to move to be more responsive, more agile. Again, easier said than done, because we are talking about, a way of things that have been in place for more than 100 years. I'll just take another 2 minutes, Tun, and then because most probably there'll be questions, and the rest we'll cover during the Q&A. Another example for digitization, we talk about digitization, everyone accepts that government of all organizations in this country have to move faster with digitization. But the approach to digitization requires a lot of rethinking about how we even manage digitization. In the past, many organizations in this country, and not just the government, look at digitization as an IT project. You draw up your specifications, you put it out, someone's developed it, you use it. a few years down the line, you say, we need to upgrade it. We need to upgrade it. But if the whole of government service delivery is based on digital platform and digitization, that most probably will no longer work. Because we have to govern through digital. We no longer look at digitization as an interface. And that again requires a lot of rethinking about how we grow, how we so-called structure our civil service and our support services and so on. This is the part that is actually a much bigger challenge than all the diagnoses, all the macroeconomic inflation growth numbers that we've had so far. At the end of the day, anyone in my position can only do either one of these two things. We can either look at the challenges and how monstrous we feel it is, and then, we spend too much time on what can go wrong. Or we can look at all these challenges and see this as an opportunity. It's a question of whether do you look is a glass half empty or a glass half full. And anyone in my position, it's an honor to have this opportunity to try to assist. I think the administration will approach it with this pride that this country has a lot of potential. It is a glass half full with a few important steps that require everyone on board. It'll be very quick before we catch up and we can sprint ahead. I hope to be able to come here again and I make a promise to both the President of Dewan Negara and Speaker of Dewan Rakyat that every time either one of them preside over a session in this august house that is on economy, I will attend and answer myself. I know that there are MPs here. Some of them will sit in very powerful new select committees. I expect to be summoned from time to time and to be grilled. I will attend and answer myself. And I hope within a year, Tan Sri, we will have this again so that when I come again next year, a year from now, we have a lot more optimism. And I think whatever we set out to do, we would have made a lot of progress within a year. For that, thank you very much. And let's chip in. And as Tan Sri Dr. Rais said in the beginning, give us a bit of space and opportunity, at least to prove that many things can be done despite how difficult and how complicated it is. Thank you very much and a very pleasant evening.